A very good evening to all our viewers. You're with me, Maria Zulfiqar Khan, and this is The Platform. Tonight on The Platform, we will discuss Iran's role in the Af-Pak region, which has been seen with a lot of criticism and suspicion by the United States and its Middle Eastern ally, Saudi Arabia. However, regardless of the United States' strong reservations, Islamabad and Kabul seem undeterred in their resolve of forging stronger ties with Iran, perhaps owing to the tense relationship and lack of trust in Washington. Tonight on The Platform, we will discuss the dynamics, the future and the ramifications of this alliance. Joining me in my studios here in Lahore is political analyst Dr Hasan Askari. It's a pleasure to have you here with us. And joining me from our Islamabad studios is former Ambassador Mr Khalid Mahmood. It's a pleasure to have you here with us, sir. Gentlemen, both welcome to The Platform. And now, without further delay, let's toss over to Washington, where my colleague Raza Naqvi awaits us. Raza, over to you.
Thank you, Maria, and welcome viewers to Voice of America's Washington studios. I'm Raza Naqvi. The revelation last week by the U.S. Justice Department of a terror plot directed by factions of the Iranian government, according to the U.S. government, against the Saudi Arabian ambassador to the U.S. has set off alarm bells here in Washington. Details of the plot are still sketchy, but many say this could lead to a dangerous escalation of the already heightened tensions between Iran and the United States. What are the implications of this plot, and how are these events being viewed in Pakistan? To discuss this, we are joined by Lawrence Korb, a former Assistant Secretary of Defense and a Senior Fellow at the Center for American Progress. Alongside him is Alex Vatanka, Senior Fellow at the U.S. Air Force Special Operations School and an expert on Middle East studies. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us. I want to begin with this issue of the terror plot that we heard about last week. We'll eventually in the show get around to Iran's sort of regional ambitions as well. But with regards to this terror plot, the one question that seems to be lingering in everyone's mind is how involved, how likely is it that the leadership in Iran, the senior leadership in Iran, knew about this plot? Mr. Korb?
Well, I think the fact of the matter is that some did. We don't know how high it up went. But the real, I think, issue is if they didn't, why didn't they? Who's really in control? And, you know, how could this happen without the top leadership doing? So I think it shows pretty much a disarray in the top leadership in Iran.
Well, is that possible? I mean, we heard about the Quds force. Some have likened this force to a arm of the Iranian government, but that operates somewhat autonomously. How does the Quds force work, and could it be possible that they're operating autonomously?
Well, I think they've gotten a certain amount of independence because after the fixed election in 2009, they relied on them to put down the demonstrations. And I think basically they're playing off Ahmadinejad against the ruling clerics, and it gives them a certain amount of freedom.
That's very interesting. Mr. Vatanka, I want to ask you this question. If it does turn out that certain elements of the Iranian government, other than simply what are quote-unquote rogue elements, if some elements of the leadership knew about this, what could be the potential fallout of that?
I mean, what they're asking for is essentially military confrontation with the United States. That's the end objective that they must have been aware of before they proceeded to go ahead and do something as high risk as, you know, setting to kill the ambassadors of Saudi Arabia on U.S. soil. Going back to what Lawrence Korb just said, the Quds force, we have to remember, is not in the business of going around assassinating people in the Americas. What they're known for having done goes back to the Iran-Iraq war when the Quds force was initially set up, is to operate in Arab countries. You've got to be able to speak Arabic to join the Quds force. That's one of the things we know about them. This is why they've been so good at it in places like Lebanon, Iraq, and elsewhere. For them to do something like this in the Americas, totally unknown territory, stands out. Now, if this turns out to be true, I get going back to what Mr. Korb said, the potential for this infighting that we know is going on in Iran, the potential for rogue elements operating around the world on a freelance basis, that is what's really dangerous.
So you sound skeptical that this was a full-out operation of the Quds force.
I just think if you look at this, this stands out massively. But I also have to say at the same time, this is a regime that has in the past acted in a way that doesn't make sense. One very good example of this is last year, October 2010, IRGC was caught red-handed supplying arms to Nigeria. geopolitically made no sense. There was massive fallout. Iran lost as a result. So we have to be careful not to look at the Iranian regime always as this rational actor. Sometimes they act irrationally.
That's very interesting. I want to get the perspective of our guests in Pakistan and direct this question to Mr. Hasan Askari Rizvi. Rizvi Sahab, I mean, this is an interesting question, and it's the plot itself was seen as sort of as a Hollywood script. I want to get your perspective on this and ask you, what do you make of it? Do you feel like the Iranian regime was involved in some way? And if you do, what could be its motives for doing something like this?
Well, the information has come from only one source, that's the American source. And this is not for the first time that charges have been leveled against Iran. We know there is a very serious problem between the two countries going back to the hostage crisis of 1979. And from time to time, US has engaged in propaganda against its adversaries, Iran, at one time Saddam Hussein, North Korea. So I think we would appreciate if we could get more concrete evidence, that's one thing. Second is that US seems to be more perturbed than Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia may not be happy with the Iranian policies in the region. Saudi Arabia may see Iran as a destabilizing factor. However, Saudi Arabia will never favor any American military action against Iran. So as far as propaganda is concerned, fine, this can be handled. But if something is done beyond propaganda, if some military action is taken in the region in the name of this problem, I think there are going to be serious consequences, not only for the US, but for the states of the region. That's why countries like Pakistan are perturbed.
Right. I'd like to take my question to Islamabad, to Ambassador Khalid Mahmood. Ambassador Mahmood, I'd like to ask you that what do you make of Iran's rebuttals when accused of plotting this assassination, that you know, this is to divert the attention from the internal situation that the US is currently undergoing, and therefore this plot has, or rather it's been called a Hollywood movie script, has been made to defame Iran?
I think we have to start from the fact that this is an alleged plot. Still, it has to be proven by some credible evidence. And in such a situation, I think Iran has rightly said that they want to have access to the alleged criminals, and also that they want to have evidence. And then after studying the evidence, it will be determined whether what is being alleged is true or not. I don't think Iran has anything to gain by doing what is being alleged. And I'm sure that the top leadership in Iran at least would not be found to have been involved in any way. Of course, there are rogue elements in every country, in every organization.
Non-state actors, as we call them.
Pardon?
Non-state actors, as we call them, Ambassador Mahmood.
Yes, you can say that. So on which the government may not have full control.
Right.
So just to jump to the conclusion that the top leadership in Iran would be involved in this, I think it would not be valid, and one should be cautious in saying this, because already this whole area is in turmoil, you know, revolutions, change of government, governments in transition. So in this state of affairs, to inject this now new element, it only adds to the instability, uncertainty, and with the consequences for not only Iran and Saudi Arabia, but rest of the region, and I think the world at large.
Right. Professor Askari, I'd like to ask you that do you think that this is perhaps building the grounds for repeating the Iraq model? Many are viewing it in that light as well.
Well, I think it is premature to suggest at this stage. At this stage, what we see is a kind of a campaign. But this has happened in the past, and we do not expect that the US would take an action similar to what was done in Iraq, because the situation is different, and the Iranian domestic situation is also different from Iraq. Further, for Iran, there is a very simple and straight option available. If some military action is taken, firstly the question is how far the US is going to succeed, because one issue is the nuclear issue, the other issue is the assassination issue. So the probability of succeeding in Iran does not exist at the moment. Second, Iran has very simple option, that is, if it can sink 1 or 2 ships in the Persian Gulf, the whole shipping system will be collapsing in Persian Gulf, and there would be very serious consequences for supply of oil to the international system. So I don't expect United States to go in this direction at this stage.
Right. Raza, now both my guests feel that Iran has very little to gain from this assassination plot, and they feel that it is too premature to be talking about and blaming Iran for this plot. Over to you.
Right. I mean, that's an interesting point. But at the same time, here in the United States, there's, I mean, 4 members of the Quds force have been actually implicated in the plot. You know, they're seen as, if not part of the hierarchy, but part of the Iranian government in some sort of way. But we haven't heard, as we heard from my guests in Pakistan, it seems unlikely that the United States will pursue military action. The question then becomes, what is the U.S. response? What is the U.S. response to this sort of thing? What can the U.S. do, and what should the U.S. do? Mr. Korb.
Well, I think what they can do is they can tighten the sanctions. They can get more international support for the sanctions. I mean, really, this is a victory for the United States, because a lot of countries have been somewhat reticent to support the sanctions to the extent that we would like. So I think this helps. I think it may even enable the United States to go after, you know, the central bank, you know, in Iran. And we already know the sanctions are hurting. There was a story in today's Washington Post that showed that their nuclear program has slowed down because of the technical problems they're having and the sanctions impact. So I think that's what they want to do. The last thing they want to do is attack them, because if they were to use military action, this would unite the disparate factions there, and that's the last thing we want. I think time is on our side if we're patient and these people can keep contending for power.
Right. Mr. Vatanka, I want to ask you this. I mean, again, we talk about what the U.S. could potentially do here. But again, when we come back to the facts of the case, again, 4 Quds members were implicated. To what extent should the United States be holding the actual Iranian government accountable for a plot of this nature? And therefore, is a response of any magnitude, economic or you know, diplomatic sanctions even, are they warranted?
You know, as was just said previously, I don't see any prospects for military confrontation between the United States and Iran. Living in this town, talking to people, I don't sense that that's what the American administration wants to go. But what I agree with is the fact that it makes life easier to get Iran's immediate neighbors to perhaps come around on the idea of containing Iran. And one thing to sort of point out is, we can all be skeptical. We can look at the previous Iranian behavior and say this one stands out. But I think it's too early to say that somehow this was made up. I do not for a second believe the United States would go ahead and make something up as big of a deal as this is. So I think we have to be very careful not to assume that this is somehow part of an American propaganda agenda.
So, I mean,
can I say,
sure.
I think it's very, this administration didn't want this to happen, because then they get under pressure to, you know, to attack Iran, and they'll say your engagement policy didn't work. This does not help them politically, I mean, at all. I think strategically it does. But no, they didn't want this to happen. This is not something that helps them politically.
Can I just very quickly highlight something else? Again, we keep looking at the Iranian state as a rational actor, and most of the times it is a rational actor. But please bear in mind, right now, the big political story inside Iran is the fight that's going on between the supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, and President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. These 2 factions in Iran are literally at each other's throats, with a number of President Ahmadinejad's, over 30 of them in jail now. So we can't dismiss the possibility that an element inside the Iranian regime close to Khamenei is going to undermine President Ahmadinejad, who, when he was in New York in September, kept talking about the idea of overhauling relations with the United States. Somebody in Tehran might be trying to undermine the president. It could be a part of the Iranian internal politics.
Just before we go to break, just to clarify for our viewers, so the Quds force is seen as closer to
the Quds force answers to the supreme leader, has nothing to do with Ahmadinejad, actually is against Ahmadinejad in the fight that's going on.
That's very interesting. We have to go for a commercial break right now, but when we get back, we'll continue talking about Iran and also its regional ambitions. Stay with us.
Welcome back. After the break, you're watching The Platform. Let's cross over to Islamabad. Ambassador Mahmood, I'd like to ask you, prior to going to this break, there was an important point raised in Washington that because of the internal tussle between President Ahmadinejad and the Ayatollah, to whom the Al-Quds Force reports, this could be the reaction of a fallout. Could that be the case?
No, I would completely rule out this explanation, because if anything harms Iran, all the differences among the Iranian peoples, they evaporate and they get united. And I don't think such a step would be taken by either of the contenders, as you have said, power in Iran. On the other hand, the same thing could be said about the United States, that there is a pressure cooker situation developing, there also, with the economy in shambles, with elections approaching, with retreat from Afghanistan and Iraq. So, I mean, such arguments can be used either way, so I don't give any credence to that proposition.
Right. Professor Askari, when we talk about, our guests in Washington have spoken about perhaps putting more sanctions on Iran. Do you think more sanctions, adding sanctions, would be productive? It doesn't seem to have been working in the past.
Well, at the moment, two types of sanctions are working against Iran. One, in 3 installments, Security Council has imposed certain sanctions. Then US has also imposed its own sanctions, but all these sanctions are limited in nature. They target certain individuals and certain institutions. Now, those kind of sanctions US can increase, can add to its sanction, but in order to get additional sanctions from Security Council, the US will have to prove that really there was a plot and there was an attempt, and if they can show it to the Security Council, perhaps Security Council will increase 1 or 2 sanctions. But a comprehensive total sanctions are not possible, because experience suggests that international sanctions do not work, and you need the cooperation of the neighboring countries to impose sanctions. I don't think Iraqi government, after the Americans have left towards the end of the year, and the Pakistani government will fall in line with the American agenda against Iran.
Right. Let's take this point to Washington. Raza, Professor Askari believes that more sanctions are not going to be productive. They haven't worked in the past, and they will not work or be productive at all.
Right, that's a very interesting point. Alex, how would you respond to that?
No, to be honest, I think sanctions are working. If you just listen to the statements of the Iranian foreign minister this week, Ali Akbar Salehi, he said it himself. Sanctions are biting. The Iranian economy is under immense amount of pressure right now. They're having problem in terms of the critical energy sector. I mean, remember, Iran depends on 80% of its income selling crude oil, and they have to be able to keep those fields, lively and operational, and they're having problems on that front. So sanctions are having an impact. Now, whether sanctions alone are going to change the strategic calculus in Tehran, that's a different story. But at least right now, again, if I could go back to what Ahmadinejad said when he was in New York, there are people in Tehran who can see that the path they're on right now is not going to take them anywhere, and they're willing to change course.
So you're saying sanctions are working in the economic sense, but in terms of trying to change Iran's strategic behavior, they haven't necessarily been as productive.
Absolutely.
Do you think adding sanctions? We've heard talk about sanctions on the central bank of Iran. That's been seen as one of the concrete measures the U.S. could take. How will that impact Iran economically? And again, do you think that might help change Iran's strategic outlook?
I wish I knew that much about economics, but it sounds like a grave move, and I can tell you the Iranians have come out and said they will kind of look at that as a declaration of war. It's tantamount to having an oil or embargo. I mean, Iran cannot sell its oil anymore, and so it's a big step to take, and I think the Iranians are worried about it. Definitely.
That's interesting. I want to ask you something about what Mr. Rizvi said. He said the international community would, again, want to see a little bit more evidence before it would be fully on board with a sanctions regime against Iran. Do you think that international support can be rallied to get for the UN sanctions or other countries to support U.S. sanctions against Iran?
Well, I think if they can show that this is correct, and I think the evidence keeps pointing in this direction. I mean, after all, somebody has confessed. We've got wiretaps. For example, we know money was wired. So I think they can make a pretty convincing case if they want to go to the United Nations, and I think that they will.
Right, but at this point, there seems to be some skepticism around the world. I mean, there was a recent statement by Russia saying we'd want to see evidence.
Well, I mean, as Alex said earlier, I mean, it sounds crazy. Why would you do this except if you're not acting completely rationally?
Right.
But when you've got wiretaps, okay, you've got money that's been wired, you've got some pretty good evidence, and you've got a confession. I mean, so we have a lot of these things because don't forget, this has been going on for quite a while. I mean, we had an informant here who they thought was a member of the Mexican drug cartel. So I think the evidence is going to be pretty good if they want to go. Now, some people obviously don't want to believe it because the Russians obviously have a relationship with Iran. But remember, the Russians did suspend selling them those surface-to-air missiles about a year ago. So I think you might be able to move them too.
And the question then becomes, I mean, will the United States actually push for this? So, I mean, we've heard about this over the past week. Do you see I mean, again, we've heard on this show, economic crises, there's a problem in Afghanistan, a problem in Iraq. The U.S. is already involved in all these international issues. Do you see the United States putting in a major diplomatic push to get these sanctions?
Well, I do. As soon as this thing dies down, and we can focus on it. You're right. There's other things on our plate. You have to decide whether the troops are going to get an immunity in Iraq. You've got the situation with the Palestinians trying to get statehood at the United Nations. So a lot on the plate. But I think certainly by the end of the year they will do that.
That's interesting. I want to go over to Islamabad and ask Ambassador Mahmood this question. I mean, what would Pakistan's response be? What would Pakistan's reaction be if, as we heard Mr. Korb say, the United States chooses to pursue further sanctions against Iran? What would Pakistan's response be?
See, this development has put Pakistan in a very awkward situation. Because Pakistan has very good relations not only with Iran and Saudi Arabia, but also trying to mend fences with the United States. So the relationship of Pakistan with all these countries are of more or less equal importance, and it will be very delicate part of diplomacy on the part of Pakistan how to steer through this situation. But I think this United States is of course preparing a ground for slapping another raft of sanctions against Iran. But that will not be that easy given the fact that Russia and China, they might have a different opinion about further increasing pressure on Iran, because both these countries have very huge economic stakes in Iran, and they have gone along the United States to a certain extent on the nuclear issue. But on this issue, just to make this as a cause for further sanctions, I doubt whether that much support will be coming from either China or or Russia. But on the nuclear issue, if it is found that Iran is violating NPT, conclusively it is proved, then perhaps China and Russia may
Right.
support the US
Right.
move, but not on this basis only.
Right. Mr. Rizvi, I want to ask you the same question. I mean, as Ambassador Mahmood pointed out, this would put Pakistan in a kind of an awkward position if the U.S. were to pursue sanctions against Iran. At the one side, Pakistan has its relationship with Saudi Arabia and obviously would not want to jeopardize those. Also, there's the tenuous relationship with the United States, but there's also this burgeoning relationship with Iran. We saw President Zardari go to Iran twice in the past year. How would Pakistan react? What would Pakistan's sort of diplomatic dance have to be to deal with these with potential sanctions?
Well, so far as American sanctions are concerned, Pakistan is not expected to honor them, and I don't expect that Pakistan would honor them. Pakistan would stay away. So far as the Security Council sanctions are concerned, until now we know that Security Council sanctions are very limited in scope. They are specific to certain individuals and institutions, and Pakistan does not come in that way because Pakistan is not dealing with those institutions and organizations. In future, I don't expect Security Council to slap total sanctions against Iranian government. Therefore, Pakistan will not be in a difficult situation. Pakistan's position would be very clear that everything has to be resolved through negotiations rather than sanctions or a kind of military confrontation.
Right, Professor Askari, now I'd like to ask you, when we began this program, we were talking about Iran's regional influence on the Af-Pak region. I'd like to ask you that, as Raza also pointed out, that President Zardari has made 2 trips to Iran, and he went specifically in June for a conference on terrorism, which Saudi Arabia was opposed to. Likewise, Kabul also attended this conference, and the United States was not in favor of it. What kind of a message are both countries sending to the United States, specifically when we talk about Pakistan following the May 2nd incident and then this conference in June?
Well, it seems that after the recent confrontation between Pakistan and the US, and a series of charges framed against Pakistan by the US official and non-official circles, Pakistan has slightly modified its policy, and it is now looking more in its neighborhood rather than with countries at such a distance. Therefore, what we see is some effort to improve relations with India. India is likely to get most favored nation status in middle of next month. And with Iran, there is an effort to expand economic relations. Pakistan is now more serious about the gas pipeline, which has been there for years, but nothing has been done. And Iran has also offered electricity to Pakistan, and Pakistan is now considering that. Iran already supplies electricity to Gwadar areas, to Turbat area, but it's a very limited supply. So Pakistan will be more oriented towards its region rather than extra region states.
Right, Ambassador Mahmood, I'll come over to you, and I'd like to ask you that when Russia and China say that Pakistan is on a course of correction or reducing Islamabad's economic and military dependence on the United States, hence it is turning to its neighbors such as Iran. Do you believe that is happening?
No, it is not either or situation. Of course, there is greater emphasis now on developing economic linkages with regional states, with Iran, with Central Asian states. With India, there is some improvement on the economic front. With Saudi Arabia, the relations are also being reinvigorated. But that doesn't mean that we are withdrawing from the international arena or the other major sources of economic power, United States, European Union,
right.
China, Russia. So these are not, I don't think these are either or situations. If more emphasis is placed on the regional partners, that is a good thing, and for which there are many mechanisms available. Right. It is ECO, it is SARC, and but that is not that we are turning away from the
Raza, I'd like to bring this
powers.
Right, I'd like to take this point over to Washington, and I'd like to ask your guest, Raza, that how is this alliance, this renewed alliance, and this renewed dependency as, or rather turning to Iran, as China and Russia have said that, perhaps Pakistan is turning more to its neighbors. How is that viewed in Washington? Is this seen as a temporary phase because of the situation that Pakistan and the current situation that Pakistan and the United States is facing?
Right. Mr. Vatanka, that's an interesting question, and it's something that people in Pakistan are often very curious about. How is Washington viewing Pakistan's recent overtures to Iran?
I mean, the American view fundamentally has been that Pakistan is focused on India and has not wanted to start having problems with Iran on any level, because if it did, it would open up a new front, and it can't afford to have another front to its west. Therefore, relations have been more or less cordial. Not too friendly, but cordial. And we can look at the old sorts of complications. For instance, the insurgents in Balochistan, how the Iranians and the Pakistanis are suspicious about one another. So I think fundamentally that's been the U.S. view. In terms of what's going on right now, and you referred to President Zardari's 2 trips to Iran in June and July. The Americans obviously paid attention to the fact that those trips took place within weeks of the killing of Osama bin Laden in Pakistan, and it happened at the same time as Prime Minister Gilani went to China. The Iranians look at this as Pakistan telling the Americans, look, we have alternative partners. We don't need you for everything, and that's why Zardari went to Tehran. So the Iranians are sitting back, trying to figure out, is this some temporary honeymoon period in Iran-Pakistan relations, but at the end of the day, when push comes to shove, Pakistan will go back to the United States because that's where its needs can be fulfilled. Is
it signaling, or is it a desire for a long-term partnership?
Look, on paper, Iran and Pakistan could do a lot together. They trade for about $1 billion a year. Iran trades more with Afghanistan than it does Pakistan.
Okay.
So there's a lot they can do, but the question is, will they?
Ms. Korb, what's your take on this this sort of warming of relations of Pakistan and Iran? How is that seen in Washington?
Well, I think, as Alex said, the question is, after we went in and got bin Laden, and also the fact that the Haqqani network, which is there, is still killing Americans, people were, wanted to come down hard on Pakistan, and they're trying to show we have other alternatives. And I think they see this as kind of a tactical move, not a strategic move. Because remember, India has very good relations with Iran too. So here you have India, Pakistan, Iran, the United States, all of those playing. That's why they call it the great game over there.
Right, and it seems like much of a game, and we'll talk more about this game, especially as it pertains to Afghanistan and Iraq, 2 countries in which Iran also has interests. We'll get to that when we get back from the break. Stay with us.
Welcome back. After the break, you're watching The Platform. Now, I'd like to ask you, Professor Rizvi, that another regional stakeholder or regional actor, if we may call it, is Saudi Arabia. It has substantial influence in the Af-Pak region. I'd like to ask you that, do you think now that Pakistan and Afghanistan both realize what kind of a double game, as many analysts say, Saudi Arabia is playing? Because we can't, of course, ignore WikiLeaks and then, of course, the recent statement coming out of the TTP that they are ready to negotiate with Pakistan, provided that an arbitrator such as Saudi Arabia is present.
Well, I think the double game is a kind of newspaper term, but in foreign policy, what actually happens, every country, Pakistan, United States, Saudi Arabia, they pursue multi-tracks at the same time. And they are moving on different tracks, and then they decide which track has to be pursued more seriously than the other track. And
but what about funding the militancy in Saudi Arabia? WikiLeaks, like I said, ought to be believed.
Well, at one time, the Saudis were funding the different kind of Wahhabi and Deoband movements all over the Muslim countries. But their policy seems to have changed now, at least the official policy, at least the state policy has changed. They are not doing it directly, individuals may be doing it. However, the first consideration of Saudi Arabia is stability in the Gulf region, which means political status quo. That's why they are perturbed when the Iranian government gives out radical kind of signals in the Gulf region, then so far as Pakistan are concerned, they are supportive of Pakistan, and they would help Pakistan to somehow diffuse the situation with Taliban. They would facilitate dialogue with Taliban, but they do not always succeed, and we don't expect them to succeed. They may be unhappy with Iran, but as I said earlier, they would not like any concrete military action against Iran. They would still like a political arrangement, some containment of Iran, nothing more than that.
Right, Raza, as Professor Askari says that no matter how unhappy Saudi Arabia is with Iran, but regardless of that, they won't want a military solution. They would stick to the diplomatic norms.
It's an interesting point, and Mr. Korb, I want to bring you in on this. I mean, when we talk about Iran, obviously, as Maria said, Saudi Arabia is a pretty big adversary, as seen from Tehran. Give us a sense of how that adversarial relationship is playing out in the Middle East today. I mean, what is on the horizon is, of course, the United States withdrawing troops from Iraq, and obviously there's still negotiations going on with the government in Iraq to whether or not to keep U.S. troops there. How is that dynamic being seen in both Tehran and in Riyadh?
Well, I think the first thing when it comes to Saudi Arabia, you saw the way that they acted in Bahrain, and that was really to prevent Iran from influencing the Shiites taking power there. I mean, they used military force to put down the uprising. That shows their concern about Iran. I think in Iraq, the Saudis do not want to see an Iraqi government that is a vassal for Iran, and so they will keep the Sunni opposition alive if they see, they see that happening. And so, yes, I mean, you do have this contention, and even it went on even when we had the troops there. I mean, it was not something that stopped once the American troops came on. It's been going on the whole time, and I think we, the United States, need to recognize that we're caught in between the two. We've done what we can in Iraq, but it's really up to the Iraqis now to chart their own course in their relations with Iran and with Saudi Arabia. And the key thing, remember, Maliki only stays in power because of the support of Muqtada al-Sadr, who is really under the control of Iran.
Right. I mean, that's an interesting point. I mean, Mr. Rizvi said this, that he doesn't think that Saudi Arabia would necessarily want to see a direct military confrontation with Iran. However, as you mentioned, in Iraq, up until a few years ago, there was somewhat of a proxy war going on between the two sides. Do you see that emerging again, if not a direct confrontation, but another sort of proxy conflict going on in that area?
Well, I think you're going to see a proxy conflict. Whether it'll be armed or not, is another thing. But I think what the Saudis will want to do is keep an opposition there so that Maliki can't just go along with everything that Iran wants. That you'll have a significant factor in the parliament that will keep him from doing that, made up of the Sunnis.
That's an interesting point. What's your take on this this sort of battleground of Iraq that has emerged for the two sides? And do you think that Saudi Arabia now will, given what we're going back to what we were talking about earlier, this plot against allegedly the Saudi ambassador, do you think Saudi Arabia will now be more aggressive in trying to mitigate Iranian influence in that region?
I'm sure they'll have more sort of resolve to stand up to the Iranians, but I'm frankly doubtful how much more they can do. I mean, going back to the issue of proxy wars, Iran and Saudi Arabia have engaged in a proxy war in Iraq going back war in Lebanon among the Palestinians. They did that in the 1990s in Afghanistan. This isn't something new. But I think what's important is I don't think Iran or Saudi Arabia are going to go as far as one to have an armed conflict. What they're going to do is try proxies. Now, it's very interesting. Now we're talking about Pakistan. Back in May, the Wall Street Journal reported that Prince Bandar of Saudi Arabia, former ambassador to Washington, had traveled to Pakistan asking the Pakistanis to create a Sunni alliance against Shia Iran. That's sort of a game to be played. That's very dangerous for a country like Pakistan with its own major Shia minority. So I'm particularly very worried about the sectarian issue becoming a dominant factor, because that's a very dangerous one, and everybody in the region would lose.
That's an interesting point. I want to take this over to Ambassador Mahmood in Islamabad. Ambassador, it's a concern that Mr. Vatanka brought up. That do you think that Pakistan might somehow get caught up in a proxy war between Iran and Saudi Arabia? I mean, we've seen evidence of this over the years, since the 1980s and through the 90s. There was sectarian issues in Pakistan itself. Many said it was influenced by outside forces. But do you think going forward, especially with the United States withdrawing from Iraq to some extent, and talk of the United States withdrawing from Afghanistan in 2014, that the Iran-Saudi Arabia conflict could influence Pakistan in some way?
I think all countries are now chastened by the experience they had in the past. There was this proxy wars sponsored by different countries, but they worked to the detriment of all. And now I think both realize that if they renew this kind of situation, it will be kind of suicidal for everyone concerned, because if there is instability, it is going to affect stability in the whole region, which is going to affect the lifeline of these very countries when their exports of oil get scuttled because of some military action here, or even the instability caused by these through proxy war. So I think there is tension. They are trying to contain each other's influence in the situation of flux which is prevailing in the region. And here I think at the moment Iranians are a little bit better placed. I say why? Because in Iraq they have a government which is inclined towards Iran. In Afghanistan, when you deny a role to Taliban, the elements which are sympathetic to Iran would have greater say in the running of the government. And also that Iran has withstood the sanctions. Of course they are hurting it, but they have not got the intended result. Their nuclear program continues, of course maybe at a slower pace, and their oil revenues are still pouring in, from China and Japan, South Korea, all these countries, despite the sanctions, So my view is that it will be effort of all the countries that to contain the situation, and I think Pakistan has some access to both Iran and Saudi Arabia, and its role could be constructive and positive if it is called upon to play any role.
Right, that's an interesting point. Mr. Rizvi, I want to ask you this, something that Mr. Mahmood alluded to, that could Pakistan potentially be sort of in a mediation role between Iran and Saudi Arabia? Could it be sort of the middleman, the person that is mediating these two sides? We have just a few minutes left, Mr. Rizvi, if you could be brief.
Well, mediation may be a strong word, but Pakistan has communicated between Iran and Saudi Arabia and tried to diffuse situation in the past. Therefore, it may do the same, but it is not in a position to mediate any conflict. Messages passing on, yes, Pakistan has done it and Pakistan can do in the future, because a confrontation or a political polemics between Saudi Arabia and Iran do not serve the interest of the Persian Gulf and Pakistan.
Right. We have a few minutes left. I'm going to get sort of a final perspective of our guests here in Washington. Mr. Korb, actually, I want to ask you this, and something we were talking about so many things. We can even get around to Afghanistan, one of the sort of guerrillas in the room. It's interesting that Iran has historically had links with the Northern Alliance. There was that incident of the bags of money going to the Karzai government. We heard recently that a delegation of Taliban members might have even been in Iran recently. What's Iran trying to do here in Afghanistan?
Well, basically, they want to keep the United States tied down and bleeding. You got to remember that the Iranians were responsible for the Bonn conference being successful. They persuaded the Northern Alliance to support, Karzai, who's a Pashtun. And then what happened? Right after that, President Bush put them on the axis of evil. So they said, well, what reward do we get? And so they want to, they want to keep us tied down. They want to keep us from, dominating the region. So they're playing all sides. They used to hate the Taliban. In fact, after the attacks of 9/11, they had a candlelight vigil and said they would do whatever they could, in Afghanistan. So it's rather interesting that they're, going with all sides now.
That's interesting. How would you look at that situation?
I think that's the usual thing the Iranians do in their foreign policy. They don't, this is the strategic mistake we always make when we look at the Islamic Republic of Iran. We look at it as an Islamic ideologically driven system. In reality, often case is the fact that they put pragmatic consideration first. They would work with the Taliban or anybody else if that serves their long-term interest. But the issue that the Iranian people suffer from is that the regime puts its interest before the national interest of the Iranian people. That's the fundamental problem that majority of Iranians support the opposition have with that country's government.
That's an interesting point. Unfortunately, we've run out of time here in Washington. I want to thank our guests over here for joining us and our guests in Lahore and Islamabad for joining us as well. Maria, I'm going to give it back to you to wrap up the show, but from here in Washington, it is good night for now.
Thank you, Raza. Professor Askari, we also have a few minutes left here in Lahore. Your final words. What do you think? What do you make of this relationship with all the stakeholders involved? What do you make of this relationship?
Well, I think international politics has become very complex. You don't see things in black and white or either or terms. Therefore, you should expect positive and negative signals going on at the same time. And you would notice that major noise for this assassination attempt came from Washington rather than from Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia has been cautious player, and I'm sure it will play its game very cautiously. It has reservations about Iran, and same can be said about Iran, but both are going to avoid a head-on collision or a confrontation anywhere in the Gulf region or elsewhere, and that's what Pakistan wants. Pakistan wants that if there are differences, those differences should be resolved through a negotiation, and Pakistan needs the Iranian support and also Saudi support for dealing with its regional problems, especially the Afghanistan problem.
So, but in the end, as our guests in Washington and Ambassador Mahmood have also said, that finally, Pakistan is turning to its neighbors, but eventually it will turn to the United States because these neighbors cannot facilitate its economical needs. Is that the case?
Well, I think this is true, that it is not either or terms. If Pakistan is getting closer to its neighbor, it's trying to expand its option. It's not that Pakistan will sever its linkages with the West. It would sever its relations with the European Union or with the United States. These countries are important, and for a country like Pakistan, it needs to have as much widespread relationship as possible. Therefore, relationship with the United States will continue with all its problems, but the relationship with the neighboring states is likely to improve.
Right. Professor Askari, it was a pleasure to have you here with us, and Ambassador Mahmood, I'd like to thank you too for joining us here on the platform. That is it from our side for this week. Do join us next week, same time, same place. Maria Zulfiqar Khan signing out for tonight.